All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Tim Welter. We're here at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. Um, I've got Mr. Frank Finelli with me. And today we're going to talk about economic statecraft and how we could leverage U.S. strengths to that end. But first of all, I'm going to go over a few administrative and logistics items. We're going to have Q&A available for the audience, so please use your Q&A button. You should see it in the Zoom if you want to ask questions. So we should be able to incorporate some of your questions as we go along, but most likely toward the end in having a discussion or in continuing the discussion. Also, you should see one of my colleagues place the article that we're going to talk about today in the Q&A. Leveraging Strength in Economic Statecraft is the name of the article that Frank and I worked on together. We're really lucky enough to work on together. And so if you haven't had a chance to see it or you want to reference it during our discussions, you'll have that available. So as I mentioned, I'm Tim Welter. I've been a senior fellow or in some kind of capacity here since 2021. I started my professional career in the Air Force as an active duty officer and then went to Capitol Hill, worked there for several years as a professional and a personal staffer. And then since then, I've been in the policy think tank kind of community. Working on things like what we're talking about today, where that intersection is between science and technology, national security, and most recently how that intersects even with economics. So I want to also say that today I'm speaking for in my personal capacity, right, for Potomac Institute, not for any government entity that I might be associated with. And to that end, the Potomac Institute has been around. This is our 30th year. Wow. And for those of you that don't know much about Potomac, we're a small think tank that works at that intersection of science and technology, policy and business, and helping leaders in all those areas come up with good policy that can be implemented. That's the other thing is we work on implementation, which is the hardest thing, right? Okay. We'll come up with the recommendations, we'll work with some of the stakeholders and try to move the country forward, but help those leaders with implementation, which again can usually be challenging, especially in this town when there's so much to work against. So with that said, Frank, I'm going to offer you an opportunity, please, to introduce yourself and tell us some of your background and why this this issue matters to you.
Well, thank you so much, Tim, and thank you to the Potomac Institute. I've really enjoyed collaborating with the Potomac Institute over the last several years on this very important issue around economic security that we'll discuss shortly. But as Tim mentioned, I'm Frank Finelli. I'm now a senior advisor at the Carlyle Group, which is a global alternative asset management company or investment firm. We're headquartered here in Washington, D.C. I'm an old airborne ranger artillery guy, soldier. I retired in the late 1990s and worked for a couple of years on the Senate staff with then Senator Dan Coates on armed services and intelligence. And then when he retired, I got fired and I went to the Carlyle Group, and that was 27 years ago. So I think I'm the luckiest guy in the world. But it really has been quite a journey. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Carlyle Group, we have about $475 billion in assets under management, and we have kind of three parts of Carlyle. One is the private equity part, where we invest and buy companies. We own about 600 or control 600 companies around the world. We also have a global credit business, which does direct lending. And then last, we have an investment solutions business that comprises it all. But again, some may be surprised, but the biggest part of our business is that global credit aspect, or the direct lending part, which ironically has grown from less than $50 billion in 2019 before COVID to well over $200 billion today. So that gives you some idea of the reaction of the markets to the financial opportunities that confront us.
So if I might pry a little bit too, with some of your experience and background, you wrote this, we wrote this, but you wrote it, in a role that you
Right.
had with Benz.
Sure.
So can you tell us about Benz and what your role is and why it's important
Right.
for what we're talking about today?
Yeah, Tim is referring to Business Executives for National Security, which is a nonprofit organization headquartered here in Washington, D.C. We have chapters in many of the large cities around the country, New York, Chicago, Dallas, so on and so forth. But it is a group of, let's say, approximately 500 business leaders. That's chief executive officers or senior partners in law firms, investment firms, accounting firms. And many of them don't come from the national security community. Many of them come from regular commercial sectors across the US economy, but we're all driven by the mission to try to bring private sector expertise to the very challenging problems that we're addressing across the national security community. And have been very lucky to have Benz as the organization led by General Joe Votel, the former combatant commander in charge of Central Command and the Special Operations Command, and now by General Tim Ray, an retired Air Force 4-star, who commanded their strategic forces and other aspects of the Air Force enterprise. They have provided a lot of thought leadership where we have gotten together with other members who are in the financial community to write about leveraging the capital markets to help advance the scope, scale, and capability of the US industrial base. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, why that's so important for economic security. But for any of you who are out there who are so inclined, I'd encourage you to become Benz members. I was tapped shortly after I arrived at the Carlyle Group by our chairman at the time, Frank Carlucci, the former Secretary of Defense, who said, Finelli, you go become a Benz member. And so I did exactly what he said. And that was well over 25 years ago. So I would encourage you, all of you, to kind of look at Benz.
No, thank you for that. And we have been able to partner
Right.
here at Potomac also in other ways too with Benz. And and you hit on this. I think one of the most important things that have come across in the research that we've done that's associated with this article is that the real ability to face the challenges that we're facing from an economic standpoint, from an economic statecraft standpoint, that's going to be best addressed not necessarily by somebody in the Capitol or in the White House, but by the power of our economic engine and the people that run it every day and work with it every day. And so that confluence, right, and the things that Benz provides that between the government and the private sector is hugely important in how we can address some of the problems that we outline in this article. So awesome. So I'm gonna take a couple minutes to kind of talk about how we ended up at this article. So if you'll bear with me on doing that, and then I'm gonna let you loose, hopefully.
Okay.
And then so you can outline kind of how you ended up where you did on a lot of this. So those of you that are familiar, maybe you're not, the 2018 National Defense Strategy was a pivotal change in how the U.S. national security community looked at the world. So in that regard, it outlined and put forth that we're now in a competition with China at the societal level. So and frankly, trying to figure out what that meant really wasn't necessarily clear. I mean, there was things that alluded to what this means and all that kind of stuff, but it was a new idea, right? It was a new approach, and especially how it intersects with our national security, right? And so to that end, we set forth on trying to figure out what that means and how that translated to how we're going to approach it, our military strength to deal with this competitive environment, this global competitive environment. So that was a big shift. COVID-19 comes along a little bit later, so we have this pandemic, right, where we're seeing our supply chains, pharmaceuticals, right, PPP, so the protective gear that healthcare workers wear, And there's a variety of other things, right?
That's right.
Yeah, as a spectrum of things that all of a sudden China clamped down on, and we felt the pains from, right? Because that's where the vast majority of these things were produced or created, and so it highlighted some supply chain vulnerabilities and other vulnerabilities that we need to pay attention to, and it really brought it to the forefront. It really hadn't been discussed, or I think there were pockets here and there that recognized what was going on, but it really brought it to to bear across the board. So I was over at the Pentagon at the time, wrapped up my work there. I was focused on a lot of this stuff. So what's left about how does that stuff, those dynamics, right, with regard to supply chain vulnerabilities, how does that translate to us being able to execute a military mission? So that's kind of what I was working on. And when I left the Pentagon to come here to Potomac Institute, I stood up the Global Competition Project, which was to kind of to get after that broader societal approach. So what are the biggest challenges with regard to this competitive environment that we're faced with? But then also, what are our opportunities, right? Where are our strengths that we can address some of them, some of these challenges that China was full in on, right? That the Communist Party over there was completely full on. So what are those competitive advantages for security and prosperity for us? And China didn't hold back, right, as far as telling us what their approach is, right? So they've got these series of 5-year plans, right? We're on the 14th 5-year plan right now. And that goes from, I think this is the last year, it goes from 2021 to 2025, right? And that particular plan, and please interject as we go along here, but
You're on a roll, keep
no, but that one's focused on, hey, we're going to be dominant in science and technology, like not just research and development, but being able to produce and dominate world markets, right? And our influence in science and technology, while reducing reliance on other countries, right, for energy and for other things that historically they've been reliant on other countries for, and just really dominate globally, right, and push forward and do it so with this in an approach that is not necessarily militant with regard to, well, military power, yes, investing heavily in military power, but to do so in a Sun Tzu way, right? So they're winning the day, not necessarily through acts of violence, but by undercutting and dominating markets, especially in other venues on the global stage. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to so actually before we go there, so this is all going on. And one of the things that we've done at Potomac Institute under the Global Competition Project was to establish a course that helped bring light to the fact that China is doing these things. They're undermining our economic institutions, right? They're eroding it by the activities that they're doing, by stealing intellectual property, but and using that intellectual property to go back to China and redesign, rename, or use that to engineer at a lower cost, lower labor rates, and all that kind of stuff, products, and then flood the market, and then basically put our folks out of business. So in order to bring awareness to what's going on there to the folks in the business sector, we stood up a course called Economic Statecraft for VC and business executives, and so Frank was one of our inaugural speakers to talk about where he sees the world from his experience, and to help educate folks in the private sector about the challenge that China poses, and to actually lay out the ecosystem and what's going on and how we might address it. So that's what the article, sorry, that was a long wind up. But that led us to where we are today, and to the article. So the speech that you gave, the presentation that you gave in the course, is a reflection of the article. So I'm gonna stop there,
Great.
and let you kind of roll with
Well, Tim, thanks so much, and I am grateful that the Potomac Institute trusted me to kind of be the lead hitter on that conference. And really, when you think about economic statecraft, as I take it up a level, we're in an economic competition with China. We're actually in a broader national security competition with China, and there's two aspects of that. There's the military competition, where you pit equipment against equipment and so on and so forth, forces against forces. And then there's the economic competition, and that's a much broader part. And so these statecraft tools are really what we're bringing. What are we bringing to this competition, this economic competition with China? And as you take a step back, you say, holy mackerel, look, the US has the biggest economy in the world. Our GDP is over $30 trillion a year. We have over $100 trillion in our debt and equity capital markets. The US dollar is the world's reserve currency, and we settle 70% of the world's transactions in way over 70% in US dollars. We spend over $1 trillion a year on national security. So what are we worried about? Well, turns out there's a lot we should be worried about. Many of us think of China as a near peer. And that may be true in some areas, but there's a lot of areas where China is a full-fledged peer. And unfortunately, there's a growing number of areas where China is a super peer compared to America. And that's why we really need to pay attention to this. And although we talk about the US GDP at $30 trillion, you'll see numbers that talk about the Chinese GDP at 19 trillion in US dollars, so on and so forth. But that's not adjusted for purchasing power. The cost of doing business in China is not the same as the cost of doing business in America. And everybody thinks that's about labor, and labor is certainly part of it, but it's about the cost of materials and a whole bunch of other things. The cost of environmental compliance, for example, that are much lower in China than they are in the United States. And if you pull up online the CIA World Fact Book, it shows the GDP of nations on a purchasing power adjusted basis, and it will show you that it ranks China's GDP as the biggest in the world on a purchasing power adjusted basis, over 20% larger than the US economy. So I think that's the perspective we ought to take as a point of departure here on this US-China competition. And so, look, China's economy has its challenges. I mean, people talk about the 3Ds. So that's debt, deflation, and demographics. And, from the debt perspective, I think everybody's well aware that China has over-leveraged itself in some areas. They've got, the real estate situation in China is tenuous, to be polite. And so we've got a lot of debt out there, a lot of shadow banking is what they call it. Institutions, let me just say. And so the total debt in China compared to its GDP is at least 3 times. And you can read different articles from scholars about, how high that really is, but it's high. But actually, in the US, it's a lot higher. Some people think that, we've got 37 trillion in government fiscal debt right now. But in addition to that, we have unfunded Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid liabilities, plus a whole bunch of unfunded pension and other labor-related liabilities. Many people think that the total debt in the US could be 6 times. So it actually might be worse than it is in China. When we come to demographics, there is no doubt that China has a population pyramid that appears to be upside down. People are leaving the workforce at a much faster rate than people are entering their workforce. That's a huge problem for them. You'll see different reports on the fertility index. The fertility index is essentially the number of people that are produced by the existing people today. So they say 2.1 is about what it takes to sustain the level of your organic population, if you will. Well, in China, it's probably well below 1.6. You'll see some estimates that take it down closer to 1.1 or 1.2. I don't know what it really is, but leaving the one-child policy in China and trying to encourage families to do more, it does not seem to be working. So you will see a lot of projections where the workforce in China actually gets smaller over time, and that is a huge problem for them. In the United States, though, our fertility index is also under 1.6. So we're not keeping up at all. What's interesting will be to see how the different policies play out over time. In the United States, of course, recently we were using immigration as the tool to try to increase the US economy or the US population. China took a very different approach. They were using automation to kind of offset the decline or the expected decline of workforce in China. And it's not uncommon to see factories that are completely automated. We'll talk in a little bit about, I served on the Defense Science Board study of the industrial base, which was an effort that took about 18 months and ended earlier this year. But some of the people on that study group had a chance to visit factories in China. And some of them, this one large company that made a series of appliances, they had exactly 3 people on the whole work site. Somebody oversaw building A, somebody oversaw building B, and somebody oversaw those 2 people. So 3 people, and they're producing all kinds of appliances out of there completely autonomously. Why is this population thing so important? Let's go back to GDP. People talk about potential GDP. That's how fast will your economy grow on a steady state going forward. And potential GDP is the sum of how fast your population grows and how fast your productivity grows. Well, if your population is declining, then that gives a headwind for you already. And then how much more productive is your population? We are hoping that artificial intelligence becomes a huge boost to productivity here in the United States. They obviously have used robotics and automation to be a big productivity boost in China. That's one of the reasons why the Chinese economy is growing at 5% and ours is growing at 2.5%. Now, if population in the United States stagnates, the growth in productivity has been about 1% per year. If GDP in the United States goes to only 1% growth rate, then our debt is a huge problem because you never generate all the wealth to take care of it. So this has real implications about the future strength of the economy, and that's the second piece. The third piece is on deflation. So China's economy, prices have declined, I think now 35 months in a row. It's down well over 3.5%. And that is a huge problem because it's got to be putting pressure on the profitability of companies all across China. And that impacts our ability to generate wealth. Now, we don't have a deflation problem. I'm not sure that's good news that we have an inflation problem instead, but this dynamic of how inflation versus deflation, or inflation in the US versus deflation in China plays out, I think is going to be another really important determinant in this competition between the US and China for economic power. So I give you that as a framework to how to think about as a point of departure, how the US stacks up against China. They're not the near peer, smaller economy that we might have thought they were 5-10 years ago.
Oh, so that's all great. And so you talked about shadow banking. Can you go into that a little bit more and maybe some of the mechanisms that China is using to undercut and erode what I guess makes up our great free and open market economy? Like what are some of the actual that you're able to see or you have seen in your experience?
Yeah.
That can help the folks that we're talking to.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Tim. And I must apologize because I don't have the expertise in these particular area, in this particular area. But suffice it to say that the Chinese government has set up their chart of accounts across their government, where at the federal level, their books are relatively clean. So like in the US, we're carrying 37 trillion of debt at the federal level. That's at the Treasury. Mm-hmm. In China, they have low debt levels at the federal level. But as you go down into their territories and the regions, this is where they have a lot of the debt. And those regions have generally increased revenue through real estate sales and other, and they generally can't tax. Mm-hmm. So this is where they're getting I think I would say probably the equivalent of commissions and so on and so forth on real estate transactions and other business operations and so on and so forth. And so they're completely upside down on some of this stuff. They have, taken in money from investors or households or whatever for homes or businesses or whatever that may be built and are not being occupied. And so there is definitely a problem with vacancy in certain aspects of the Chinese economy. Now, they have placed that debt in entities that are associated with kind of some of these shadow banks where the federal government is not accountable for the solvency of those entities and the extent to which the regional governments are is kind of an open question. In the situation of the real estate bubble, I will say, very prominently several years ago, you would see the default of some of the very large Chinese real estate holding companies. But when you look closer, what they did was they defaulted on all their foreign bonds. So all the international creditors got hosed. The Chinese creditors or the Chinese investors, that's a different story. And it appears that the central government has provided enough capital to keep those entities solvent so that they don't default and harm Chinese households. And so it's a question of here, what debt does the Chinese government really recognize and be accountable for paying versus which one they can kind of hold at risk. And I think this is where a lot of the shadow banking kind of comes into play.
Thanks for digging into that a little bit. Appreciate it. When it comes to, so we talk a lot about some of the advantages, right, that China's taken, has reached out to take it, or has used, right, to realize their goals, right, that they talk about in their 14th five-year plan. One of those is the Belt and Road Initiative,
Sure.
right? So can you talk to us a little bit about, okay, what is the result of this Belt and Road Initiative? What is it exactly? Is it like what are the what are the legitimate aspects of it? What are some of the things that are more coercive or adversarial, right?
Right.
And what has it resulted in?
Well, if I can, maybe I want to go a little bit left of that question
absolutely.
first. So, and I mentioned this Defense Science Board study that I participated in that looked at the U.S. industrial base. And we had a chance to look at it from both an unclassified perspective, getting information from industry and programs across the now the Department of War, then the Department of Defense, as well as a whole series of classified briefings where we would get information about the Chinese industrial base. And we've got challenges, to be polite. I would say three key takeaways that have really influenced my thinking here is one, the US industrial base is much smaller than the Chinese industrial base. And when you look at the Defense News Top 100 that they put out every year, and they just put out one in August, an update for the last year. If you go back to 2018, there were no Chinese companies on that list. That's probably because they didn't provide the data. But on last year's, 4 of the top 12 were Chinese companies. 6 were US companies, and then you had a European and a British one that rounded it out. And it's interesting because one of the former top 12s from China did not provide data, so was not included this year. So anyhow, China Electronics Technology Corporation. So, but when you add this all up, they show the defense revenues, and we know, look, we're spending $1 trillion a year.
Right.
The defense revenues on the Chinese side are smaller, about half the size. But when you adjust those for purchasing power, which is at least 2 to 1 in this sector, they're spending about on balance the same amount. But their goods are not as complex and not as expensive. And so the output is much, much higher. And so we think that in many of the areas of the defense industrial base, they could easily have 3 times the capacity that we do in the United States. But the important part is that under their military civil fusion strategy, which is part of these, this plenary that they're working right now, these 5-year plans, their large companies are dual use.
Mhm.
So the biggest aerospace and defense company in the world by far is what was the Aviation Industries Corporation of China. Or AVIC as it was called, they're now going through some renaming, but it has $120 billion in revenue. Even Boeing with all its commercial aircraft isn't above 80,
Wow.
right? AVIC is 50% larger than Boeing. The number 2 in the world is China Shipbuilding at over 110 billion. All right, the top one in the United States now is Lockheed at about 78 billion. All right. And so these Chinese companies are much, much bigger, but what's important is they are subsidized to maintain the mobilization capability to convert from commercial to defense production in conjunction with these mobilization plans. In the US, we don't have any such mobilization plans that are well exercised. So that's the second real heads up.
Significant deal.
Yeah, the third area, which we'll get more to your question about the Belt and Road, is US supply chains have tremendous risk in them because we do not source the materials from US or in many cases partner or allied sources. China, on the other hand, has assured supply chains. And that's everything from the elements on the ground through the final production. Now, there may be some, chips here or fancy components there that they're looking to import from the US or Europe. But by and large, they got it all themselves. And they have used the Belt and Road Agreement, which is 150 bilateral financial agreements. I mean, there's only 190 nations on the planet. They've got bilateral financial agreements with 150 of them. And those financial agreements are collateralized by rights to critical infrastructure assets in those countries. Now, how enforceable those are is a matter of discussion, but a lot of countries don't want to test the Chinese on what they might really do if they default.
Sure. Right.
Now, we have seen a number of those agreements default. And to your question, there's a lot of the projects under those Belt and Road agreements, whether it's dams or infrastructure, ports or telecommunications or whatever. There's a lot of those projects aren't exactly going. So, I can only hypothesize on what China's real objectives were for behind those loans or whatever. But what they're doing is they're locking up critical resources in critical parts of the world that assure their supply chains. And so if the deals don't go well, they amend and extend them, they get more rights on the critical infrastructure assets, and they continue to have these assured supply chains. That's a problem for us. Mm-hmm. And so now, and we can talk about this in more detail later, but China has embargoed, they've essentially weaponized the periodic table through the agreements that they have made with their Belt and Road partners. So they control roughly half of the top 50 critical elements for America, according to the US Geological Survey. And about half of the ore that goes into these critical minerals, it comes from China, sources in China and Mongolia and so on and so forth. The rest of them come from imports around the world, a lot of them from the Southern Hemisphere. But the processing capability, they made the strategic decision to invest in the processing capability and capacity in mainland China. So a lot of the ores from all over the world, to include the rare earth mining from MP Materials in California, went to China for processing. I don't think it is anymore, but that's how China controls this. And it sets up a dynamic where we have inherent risks, whereas they have more assurance.
Absolutely. So you did mention a term, the Civ Mill fusion.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a little bit more and how it's key to their strategy and what they've been doing?
Yeah.
And I think you alluded to it a little bit, right, with the dual use, right? Talk about that, like this approach is,
and I'll tell you, I would encourage everybody to search out the 2 books by Dr. Jonathan Ward, who's over at the State Department now. Decisive Decade is one of them, because he lays out this military civil fusion in much better detail than I can explain. But essentially, it is the the strategy that underlies all the different parts of the whole of nation Chinese approach to a strategy that assures energy, food, and critical materials. And so what they have done is they have figured out how they need to influence different inputs from around the world and in mainland China to put China on a path to become the world's leader. Certainly in the critical materials area, certainly in energy, certain area of renewable energy areas and other parts, while de-risking food for their population, energy, and kind of currency. We should talk about that later, how they've de-risked themselves from the dollar. But I think this is part of the whole of nation strategy where things are deliberately set up as dual use, but they can flip the switch. We really, whether we have those switches or not is a question a lot of people should debate, but boy, they haven't been exercised in a long time.
No, and so to that point, I think, and we were talking a little bit before, we opened the discussion about, we finally have policymakers, I think, to a certain level, and folks in industry, right, that are recognizing some of our vulnerabilities and some of our shortfalls, but also have been identifying tools that we can use from a policy perspective, but and in the you know, from an economic perspective that we can use. There's things like from a policy standpoint, there's a select committee in the House side that's focused on competition with China. And I think last month even they brought up one of the points that we talk about a little bit in the article is the fact that China produces 80,000 PhD STEM per year, which is like more than twice.
3 times. Yeah, almost 3 times.
Almost 3 times what we do in the United
But
States.
the important part of that is 1/3 of those 80 to 90,000 are educated in the best US and European universities.
Right.
So this isn't like they all went down to the corner drugstore university and got their PhD. No.
Plus, one of the things that the report talks about too is the fact that a lot of the research that they've worked on has security implications, right? And it's taxpayer funded, right? And so, and some of those folks, when they graduate, they're leaving, going back to China and using that exposure to that intellectual property, right? And their studies to capitalize on, and again, increasing our vulnerability. You know, adding to this military civil fusion, right, approach, where there's no distinct lines. It's a societal approach, right? We have more delineated lines, right, with the defense industrial base here than they do. So, yeah, so it's and so the report goes on to talk about how it's a prolific issue, but it's starting to be addressed, right? You're seeing it in legislation. Right. The committee has been successful in putting some provisions in the NDAA the last couple of years. You're seeing some initiatives over in DoD, right? The Office of Strategic Capital, and you're seeing this economic defense unit, right? Start to gain some traction. So, how familiar are you with those two initiatives?
Quite a bit.
If you're willing to talk about some of those,
well,
I'd be great to get your perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I mean, these are really, really important areas, and my hat's off to Deputy Secretary Ward Feinberg for really taking the leadership role and carrying the mantle for these important initiatives. And I think he comes into this position from, vast experience in the financial sector, where he has seen the operations of Chinese investors and Chinese companies competing with US companies and US investors around the world. And so it has been, US investment firms, so on and so forth. But look, you're competing against the government of China and whatever affiliates they're putting out there on the playing field. But they're bringing everything to the fight, and you're bringing your firm essentially. So we got to turn that around, and he's doing some tremendous work to set up this economic defense unit, which, as you mentioned, I mean, that really was a manifestation of policy that came from the Hill in legislation to mention things like that in collaboration with the Department of Defense. And then to set up this Office of Strategic Capital to really become a catalyst to leverage one of the few areas of comparative advantage that we have, and that's the depth, breadth, and scope of our capital market. So I am quite impressed with what they're doing to make a range of tools available, financial tools available to help accelerate investment. This is it's gonna take more than what's in the annual appropriations to catch up with where we are. But just to give somebody perspective about, why this is so important. I mean, we talked a little bit about critical materials and how far behind we are there, but that's not all. These folks recognize that there's other core areas of the global economy where the US isn't even on the playing field. Take 5G and telecommunications. The Chinese company Huawei has over a 35% global market share. Number two is Nokia, that's not even 15%. Huawei will always be the world's leader in the global share of data because they got over 90% of the Chinese market and they got 35% of the rest of the world. That's it, game, set, match. Now, whether that matters at the end of the day is a different question, but so they've got a dominant position in 5G. What concerns me is that they evidently have an IRAD budget that is larger than the rest of the world combined for telecommunications research and development. So this moat that they are building around Huawei is probably getting bigger, not getting smaller. And that's a huge concern. You take port operations. There is no global US-owned port operations company. China controls over 60% of the world's 100 largest ports. They control the bill of lading systems. They control the control systems for the cranes that are unloading containers all around the world. So, everybody talks in the military, they talk about contested logistics and this and that, how we get things around the world. I mean, people aren't, addressing the fact that when you pull up into a port, it's likely that you're going to have a Chinese guy waving at you. That's a problem. And we just don't have any footprint in that area. We don't have US flag ships by and large. Okay. This is something that is, again, an initiative behind the shipbuilding part. Another one that I would point out to you is nuclear. Not one of the top 5 commercial nuclear companies in the world is US owned. And in visits to Idaho National Labs and speaking with physicists there and stuff, I mean, they'll indicate that China probably has the most advanced commercial nuclear technology at scale. Now, we may have them beat in the small modular reactors and all that other type of stuff, but countries all over the world now embrace nuclear power as green, or at least it's good now. It was bad, and they want nuclear power to be part of their base generating capability because of the advantages around a cost and sustainability perspective over time. Well, every one of those competitions that China wins, and they win a lot of them, is a 40-year strategic agreement for technical assistance and fuel. So how is the US going to become a partner of that country when China controls their nuclear reactors? These are the types of things that I think we have to wake up to. And it's part of fundamentally getting US corporations and really new technology out onto the playing field. But as you mentioned, in addition to China's continuing advanced skills in stealing technology and intellectual property, they're now developing a lot themselves. And so, I believe that innovation and technology development processes remain a comparative advantage in the US, but boy, China is trying to close that gap.
Yeah, and I think to your point, and I think we make this point in the article, and you hit on it earlier. They are far and away not just closing that gap, but superior in some of these areas, right? Whereas historically, it's one of those things where they would mimic, right, copy. And we always have the advantage in design, especially on the technology side, and I think we do in a lot of areas still. But that's not the case anymore, right? And they're far and away ahead on many of these in many of these areas. You talked about you said you want to get back to currency. Did you want to talk about that at all?
Well, I mean, a lot of people,
points there that you wanted to make.
So I think China really has de-risked itself from the US dollar. I mean, as we said earlier, the US dollar, I mean, well over 70% of the world's transactions, commercial transactions are settled in US dollars. And that's really important. And look, they don't want the RMB to be the global reserve currency. I mean, they don't want to be tied down. What that would do to restrict their monetary policy would be,
Right.
I think, a bridge too far. But what they have done is if you go back 10 years, 2014, 2015, China held 1.7 trillion of the US's then 17 trillion treasury securities. All right. Today, they've got less than 800 billion of 37 trillion. So they have gone from 10%, holding 10% of the US's treasuries to less than 2%. Okay.
Yeah.
Tremendous.
Yeah.
They also have increased their gold reserves tremendously. And they have built these alliances with the expansion of the BRICS, where they now have surrogates all around the world carrying out, anti-dollar policies. And so we saw this most prominently in Russia, where they came in to essentially make the Chinese, the RMB, the reserve currency of Russia, displacing the dollar, which opened up Russian companies and banks to the global financial markets through China. If you can believe it, in 2023, despite all the sanctions, Russia's GDP grew 9 times faster than the GDP of the European Union. That's mind-boggling. Yeah. Now, sure, it was on the war footing and all that other type of stuff, but it was enabled by China displacing the dollar as a reserve currency in Russia. So you look at Brazil, you look at Indonesia, you look at all these other countries that have come in around the BRICS, and where's India at the end of the day, right?
Sure.
Huge question mark. So we've got these de-dollarization schemes that are being kind of manipulated across the BRICS plus. There is speculation that in some of these amend and extend of the Belt and Road agreements, they are mandating that countries settle some of their commercial transactions in Chinese yuan, not US dollar. I mean, I haven't seen the documentation, so I can't confirm that. And then the other issue is on central bank digital currency. I mean, the Chinese piloted their central bank digital currency during the 2022 Beijing Olympics. Everybody in the Olympic Village, whether you were a coach, a participant, or an athlete, or a spectator, you had to use their central bank digital currency in the Olympic Village. And it evidently worked well.
Sure.
That takes a whole range of transactions out of the visibility of the world's financial markets. And is that something that they could flip the switch and increase at some point? Probably. Right. Are they using it surreptitiously to do bad things to US interests around the world? Wouldn't be surprised. So these are the types of things that I think we all need to be aware of.
So a lot of doom and gloom.
No, well,
the whole idea of our assigning this discussion is awareness to what the situation is, so we can do something about it, right? And so we can understand our strengths, right, and leverage those strengths, and that's a core part of the what we talked about in the article. So that said, sitting where you've been sitting, right, with Carlisle, with Ben's, right, working with DoD and stuff, what are our best strengths, right, as a country to deal with some of this directly, right? So we can ensure our enduring prosperity and security both moving forward.
Well, I think clearly we've got to leverage our capital markets. That's a clear advantage, and we have to get lower cost of capital financial support into our companies. This isn't about getting venture capital out there at 30% rate of return. Right. This is about getting credit out there at 6, 7, 8%, so that the average weighted cost of capital for companies that are trying to grow in this industrial base is manageable. That'll be a huge enabler. The second part is that we really do need to bolster and I think coordinate our technology development processes, our innovation and for the development and the transition of technology. And this is where I think great progress is being made. Look, we have attracted a lot of investment into defense technology or just broader technologies that can be adapted for national security purpose. I think that's huge. I don't have any way to measure it. You read different articles about it, but you know, I think it's pretty fair to say that innovation in America is better than innovation in China. And there's corruption problems and a whole bunch of other things that they've got to deal with that hopefully we don't have to deal with here in America. So that is the second part. The third is how we can leverage our allies and partners. And quite frankly, if you read the Draghi report on the competitiveness of the European Union, it's not a good story. I mean, they have got to invest $800 billion a year to help reindustrialize Europe, was his conclusion. But reindustrialize or not, the key point is what happens to the markets. All right. If European markets get closed down to have a lower propensity to purchase Chinese goods, while the US markets are closing down on Chinese goods, there's nowhere for this overcapacity in China to go. And the key question in my mind right now is China is without a doubt overproducing in many, many sectors. That stuff is getting shipped out to other parts of the world, and their GDP is still growing over 5% per year. But if this stuff is all held up in inventories that are growing in the four corners of the planet, they've got a problem. And so this is the type of stuff. How does the US work to restrict China's access to markets of our allies and partners while we continue to grow and assure our supply chains? I think those are kind of three areas that we really could work on.
Are there opportunities that you've seen for us to co-design, co-produce on the defense side of things, on the security side of things with countries, with other countries? I think about Pillar 2 of AUKUS, which is, it's not talked about very much. Everyone focuses on Pillar 1, but Pillar 2, talks about collaborating on all kinds of technologies, hypersonics, right? AI, quantum, and I think there's and policymakers are talking about it. I know the White House has talked about it. The Department of War, Department of Defense has talked about reviewing it. Is there an opportunity there for collaboration to? I think they're calling it 4DIB, right? To work on with other countries, especially our closest allies.
Sure.
On bolstering those supply chains.
Yes, I've got to think without a doubt. And I mean, you just look in commercial areas, such as shipbuilding. I mean, look, there's other friendly nations around the world that have way better shipbuilding capability than we do. And so we have to take advantage of those types of things. And I do believe that certain nations have comparative advantages in certain areas of technology and stuff like that. There's nothing wrong with constructive competition in some of these areas, but I think we cannot afford to try to do everything ourselves.
Right.
And we ought to identify where other nations have comparative advantages, and we ought to leverage that to the full extent.
All right. So we're getting close here. I'm gonna look here real quick to the questions that are being offered. Let's see. How can we best prioritize competition with China as the new national defense strategy looks to prioritize Western Hemisphere security? So now it hasn't been released yet.
No,
it might that happened today, but I haven't seen it. So, but I do know that there's inklings toward that, at least toward that end. I don't necessarily know if I'd speculate.
Yeah, I don't think there's a de-emphasis on the competition with China.
Okay.
And again, let's not lose sight of the fact that our national security is this combination of the military security and the economic security.
Right.
And so, deviations on the military security side of things, we should understand the rationale for and work that piece of it. But this economic competition remains, and I would encourage us, and that really is a whole nation effort over here.
Right.
And I would just encourage us to stay focused on that. And look, commercial R&D spending in America dwarfs that in China. And I think it's good news that, I mean, you go back to the early 1980s, research and development spending, scientific spending in America was roughly 50% government, 50% commercial. Today it's 80% commercial and 20% government. And that's a good thing. And so leveraging where that commercial technology is going and how to funnel some of it for offtakes for national security purpose is clearly something we've got to continue to push.
So speaking of a strategy, I don't necessarily know that at least overtly, at least formally, we don't necessarily have one that's been published by the last administration, this administration on economic statecraft.
Right.
There's these disparate efforts, really good efforts going on, you know, in commerce and treasury, coming out of the White House, coming out of, you know, the Congress, right? That, that, I mean, if you step back and look at it, it looks like they're following some kind of strategy, some kind of guidance. But do you think it would help if we had a formal stated, hey, this is the strategy, this is the objectives that we're getting after, and this is the entity in charge, really of helping us with the doctrine on executing that strategy?
Uh, I would say yes. But I would encourage the administration to kind of crawl, walk, run, if you will.
Okay.
There's a lot of stakeholders
Yeah.
across government in this, and so how you organize to take it on board is really, really important. And just having a guided or just kind of a high level kind of vision and set of objectives for economic security that would perhaps come from the senior levels of government as a starting point.
Sure.
You know, might be helpful in just starting to align people or creating more awareness of the challenge we're in. Look, one of the things that makes America great is how competitive people are across all the levels of the economy. We want that to continue. And we want people to realize that, sure, you're not only competing against, you know, the company in the next city or whatever, you're competing against the folks from China that are knocking on the door wanting to sell stuff in here at half the price.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So we want to keep that competitive friction going and that motivation going. And so I'm not sure that it would be helpful to have a whole series of documentation about this is the ABCs of U.S. economic security policy.
Okay.
But again, smarter people than me would look at what's the best approach to kind of get the message out there.
Gotcha. One more last question. We only got a couple of minutes left. One of the things that comes up when we're looking at this from a research perspective over and over and over again is how do we incentivize the private sector to, first of all, care about this, right? And second of all, get involved and be engaged with it so they can think about it as part of their calculus when they're making risk decisions or making investments. What is I mean, it's what will incentivize?
I would say that's very simple. It's risk return. I mean, there is a competition for capital. And that competition is on a risk-adjusted return basis. And the good news is the Department of Defense spends $450 billion a year on contracting. That can be used to do a lot to adjust the risk to incentivize investment. And I think that's what we need to take more advantage of. I'm very encouraged by some of the financial tools that are being developed by the folks in the Deputy Secretary of War's office that I think are going to be quite successful in incentivizing more investment and more lending into this sector. So look, it's a good thing that markets are very transparent here. All right. Yeah. Money will flow where it gets the best risk adjusted return. And that's okay.
Great. All right. Last thing, if you had to, what are the top takeaways here? Like if you're walking away from this discussion, and thanks again for doing it.
Oh no, it's my pleasure.
And thanks again for your partnership and for your sharing your experience in this article and making it a successful discussion. But what should the top takeaways be for the folks that are joining us, right? And the folks that had the chance to read this article?
I would say the biggest challenge we have right now is really understanding our supply chain risks. That's not understanding what's going on at the tier 1 and tier 2 level. That's understanding what happens when it goes into the ground. What are the elements that are in the components that are in your products? If you're a service provider, do you have embedded code on components that are coming from China? You know, this is the thing that we've got to understand. I think we're far more vulnerable on the supply chain, and it's hardware, it's software, and it's data. Yeah. And so that's what I would encourage people to take a closer look at.
Yeah, and to top that up, I think you did mention at one point in the article too that it's getting easier to have custody of what those supply chains look like these days. The technology is getting better.
Right.
We're using AI, we're using automation to help that out. So it should, in theory, be.
Yeah, and there's good firms like Exeter that really can nail down through into this thing. So there's a broad range of commercial offerings that are out there to help companies.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much again.
You're very welcome, Tim. Thanks again.
Appreciate it.
Good deal.
Yes, thank you.